Okay, I think enough time has passed since me releasing the combat demo that I can start talking about the design philosophy of the combat in my game. Combat is a very obvious weak area in the original DOS Prince of Persia games. The mechanics are generally similar across both games, and you can't even pull out your sword unless there's an enemy in front of you in Pop 1, so I'll be showing it off in 2. You have the ability to move forward or backward. And exactly two commands, a thrust by pushing the attack button, and a parry by pressing up. In Prince of Persia 1, the button for hanging or doing small steps was the same as the thrust button, while in Pop 2, the two buttons are different, but the hanging button simply does nothing in combat. Movement during combat is quite slow in both games. Here's me moving as fast as I can. I definitely wanted something a bit more zippy, so one of the first things I did was make the player take faster steps. This especially applies when close to an opponent, where the steps become even smaller and faster for quick, precise movements. There's no way to have a continuous defense in either Prince of Persia game. The parry is only active for a relatively small amount of time. But this is really no issue, since swings are slow enough that you can parry them on reaction. After a successful parry, you can hit the attack button to riposte. The opponent can actually parry the riposte and riposte back, which you can then parry. This creates a ridiculous situation where both player and enemy can lock into a never-ending loop of parry ripostes. Eventually the comms are simply programmed to drop one, just so the player can win the encounter. I strongly sought to avoid this scenario in my game, so one of the first things I decided is that a riposte after a successful parry is a true punish and cannot be prevented by the opponent. Because a successful parry is now guaranteed to be rewarding, I made its whiff duration much longer to add some risk. Obviously this would make parry much too strong against the original thrust, so I sped it up. Now the thrust is too fast to reliably react to with a parry. The parry is more of a way to punish comms if you understand their patterns. Now, because the basic thrust is so much faster, and because the main counterplay to it had a risky whiff and couldn't be done on reaction, I needed a halfway option to give the player a bit more safety, so I came up with a blocking mechanic. By holding down the hang button, which was previously unused in combat, the player guards against any incoming thrusts. The guard can be held indefinitely, unlike parry, but doesn't allow for the possibility of riposting. Obviously, this gave me a new problem, that players or comms holding guard were completely invincible even if it meant they were entirely inoffensive. So, I added a new attack. By pressing up in the attack key, the player now gets a powerful overhead strike, which cannot be guarded. The startup is quite a bit longer than the basic thrust. Otherwise, there would be no reason to use the basic thrust at all, but to further incentivize this attack, I additionally gave it quite a bit more range than the basic thrust. So what about counterplay for the overhead strike? Because of the long startup, it was fairly easy to simply step back on reaction to the swing. But this was very inoffensive. The parry had very nice synergy here. While the basic swing was too fast to consistently parry, one could reliably parry the overhead. This added significant risk to just throwing out overhead swings. I think it also made defense a lot more fun, because you couldn't simply be mindless while guarding, you had to react to specific things your opponent did. But once again I had a problem. Someone holding guard and simply reacting to overheads with parries could essentially have perfect defense. Not only that, but unlike the perfect defense you could have before by holding guard, this one had an offensive presence because you could riposte the overheads. Anticipating players could simply hold guard and wait for overheads, I added a secret mechanic. If you do an overhead swing then hit guard, it cancels the animation, effectively giving you an overhead feint. If the opponent reacted to the feint with a parry, not only could you attack their parry in recovery, you could do it on reaction. However, you can't guard during the feint, so it obviously has counterplay. The opponent can simply attack you as you do it. But if the opponent attacks you and it's a real overhead, you get hit. Basically, it's a 50-50. But it's a 50-50 you could also avoid just by backing up, which would be safe against a real overhead and a feint, at the cost of losing a bit of ground. Already there was some refreshing complexity going on in my game. I programmed the rushdown comms of my game to use the feint, then deliberately didn't include the existence of the feint in the instructions. My hope is that the players would see the comm use the feint and figure out they could do it themselves. Naturally, I made a few of the comms respond to the feint with a parry, and in fact, it's basically a free win on some of the tougher ones. Now, one other problem with Prince of Persia's combat is that a player can simply stand outside the opponent's range and endlessly attack. This prevents them from ever moving in. And if you ever get lucky and time a random swing with them stepping in, you get a guaranteed hit. This obviously breaks the AI and would force a stalemate in a theoretical fight between two human players. My solution to this was, in my opinion, simple and elegant. For both the regular and overhead swing, the player has a wider hitbox and recovery. This adds some danger to throwing out reckless swings in neutral, which in turn makes it harder to control or prevent your opponent's movement. It also forces the player to be very aware of the max range of their attacks. Every mechanic I've mentioned so far, including preventative mechanics to address problems I anticipated, I actually decided on before I even started working on the combat, but there were a few other mechanics I had planned where I completely soured on them after testing them out. I wanted the combat to be quite dangerous, with the possibility of dying even if you were skillful and prepared, just like a real sword fight. My plan was to incentivize players to avoid combat if possible, and instead try and stick to the platforming to avoid fights. So a mechanic I initially conceived was that the player could tap backward right after taking damage to make the cut a glancing blow. If the player didn't do this, they would die instantly, or take double damage. I hadn't decided. We implemented this, and I immediately hated it. It definitely made the combat significantly more dangerous, but the window was too small and easy to miss, and I didn't want to extend the hit stop to make it easier. Additionally, it was too unintuitive and way too punishing. I axed this mechanic entirely, and never released a playable build with it. Another mechanic I had planned was that on a successful attack, the player could cancel to a forward step to maintain their pressure and gain ground. But if the attack was blocked, the forward step would be punishable. In order to make it punishable, we added a way to riposte out of blocking. This riposte would hit someone who stepped in, but miss against someone who didn't step in, making it obviously much worse than parry riposte. But this had two huge problems. First, the block riposte was very difficult to do since you had to time it while guarding an attack that was hard to react to. Second, if the attacker didn't step in, the block riposte would miss and could actually be whiff punished on reaction. This created a very stupid scenario where you had to do a difficult command on a guess which could be punished on sight, combined with the fact that the step in was only very theoretically rewarding, and the whole mechanic might as well not have been in the game. And immediately, the attack into forward step cancels broke the AI of just about every comm. Doing attack into forward step repeatedly forced them to endlessly block or get hit. And programming the comms to use the block riposte made them sitting ducks if they ever used it against attacks where the players didn't step, so the player could get easy wins just by making them guard attacks and reacting to the ripostes. We had to program a backstep out of guard specifically so the comms could get out of attack forward step loops. Though I was a little unhappy with the mechanic, I kept it in at the time. I left the forward step from attack out of the combat instructions, as well as the block riposte and block backstep, once again hoping players would find them by observing the comms who used them. It was at this point that I released the first combat demo. The feedback I got was interesting and enlightening. First, I had a lot of players complain to me that the comms had longer reach than the player, not realizing that their attacks were being whiff punished. Since they were frustrated with the mechanic and did never get to a point where they understood it, I consider this a design failure on my part. A few players successfully found the feint based on watching the comms, and used it to beat some of the harder comms. I consider this a design success. To my knowledge, no one found the block riposte. Since that was the main counter to the comm who spams attack forward steps, a lot of players did really poorly against him, despite the fact that he's intended to be one of the easy comms. A lot of people laughed at how bloodthirsty he seemed to be. Another design failure. Most people managed to beat the 6 main comms. Additionally, several people managed to beat the 7th comm, who was loosely designed to be unbeatable, although I did know 2 reliable strats to beat him prior to release. I consider this to be a design success. Finally, almost all the feedback I got was positive. Huge design success. The most consistent feedback I got was actually identical to the main feedback I get for the platforming, which is that it feels strange at first, but then becomes fun and fair once people understand how to play. Creating that feeling is basically my game design objective, so that was great to hear. For another few months, I stewed over the existing combat mechanics on how to improve them, and came up with a few new ideas. First, the lunge. By pressing towards an attack at the same time, the player gets an attack and forward step in one. The range is better than the standard swing, and it's about the same speed, so it's fantastic for whiff punishing. The downside is it has significantly more recovery. It's more punishable if it misses, and in fact, it's the only attack in the game that's punishable on block. Once again, this gives the defensive player a new thing to think about. They have to react appropriately between the basic thrust and the lunge. My ideas with this attack were as follows. It indirectly makes blocking stronger since blocking is the main counterplay, and it makes whiff punishing easier since it works at more ranges. At the downside that if you miss the whiff punish, it carries more risk. The increased whiff punishing potential makes weaving in and out to bait attacks a bit more feasible. Previously, after a backstep, your basic thrust would be out of range, while your overhead would be too slow. And finally, it would chase down backsteps, and give the player a committal but effective option against comms who tried to move away. The other new attack I added was a stomp, done with back plus attack. The feint was a bit too cryptic, and I wanted a function akin to a fighting game grab, which could be used to break the guard of overly defensive players. The range is very small, and since it's a foot attack, it actually deals no damage, but the reel it inflicts sets up a guaranteed thrust. I could just make it a leg slice and have the attack itself deal damage, but ultimately I think a 1-2 combo is simply more fun and satisfying to execute. This does a nice job of punishing overly defensive play. If you let an opponent get too close, suddenly you're vulnerable to someone stepping on your foot, which cannot be guarded or parried. The only counterplay against this is to attack them when you think they're going to try and approach, which is vulnerable to a parry or a backstep with punish, or backstep when they get too close, which surrenders ground and can even be hit by a predictive lunge. One issue with the stomp right away is that if you didn't attack, stomp into stomp was an infinite, while if I made the recovery of the stomp longer so that the player who got stomped recovered first, it felt punishing towards the player who landed the stomp but missed the combo. My solution was to have a successful stomp push the opponent out of stomp range, but still in thrust range. Finally, the most recent changes I made were to overhaul the attack into step mechanics. I took out the block into riposte mechanic entirely since I didn't really think I could make it work. On hit, attack into step now leaves the player very close enough to immediately land a stomp. And once again it's a 50-50, since if the opponent backsteps you can immediately catch them with a lunge. Though they do have time to get out of the way of a normal thrust. Of course, if you lunge and they block, they get a punish. But if they're blocking, they get opened up by the stomp. Of course, the mix-up is optional. You can instead simply attack to push them back out, which also beats them if they try an immediate attack of their own. This mix-up is made more potent because it's quite hard to react to. If you're caught off guard, it's like you took 2 damage. If attack into forward step is blocked, it's not punishable anymore. Instead, you're just left close at a frame disadvantage, so the opponent gets an identical mix-up on you instead. Obviously, this means you can't spam attack into forward step anymore, because the opponent can simply block it, then attack you before you can do anything but block or parry. The beauty of this is that it's reactable, but only barely. The comms sometimes try and punish it, but sometimes let it slip, so it's kind of like a turnstile. Now, the purpose of this sequence is to reward players who are aware of when their attacks are going to hit or be blocked. It's possible to cancel the overhead swing into forward step too, but I realized that since the overhead swing can't be blocked, players can mindlessly cancel the overhead to forward step and it would never be a bad idea. So I made it so the overhead to forward step is comparatively small and doesn't give the stomp mix up. Lunge, meanwhile, does not cancel into forward step since it always advances regardless of what you input, which was necessary both in giving it long reach and in making it punishable. Finally, stomp into attack canceling to a forward step would have immediately led to a mix-up with another stomp into attack, which obviously would have been bonkers. So for the stomp thrust specifically, you cannot forward step cancel. This especially works because the regular thrust had slowly gotten outclassed by other attacks. Overhead for range or guard break, lunge for whiff punishing, stomp for guard break. The only ways to reliably land the regular thrust are after a parry or as a whiff punish. So it's harder to land than the other attacks, but if you can land it, it's especially rewarding because it often results in a 1-2 punch. Parries and whiff punishes are the hardest techniques to use reliably, so giving players who can land them an extra edge is good design, I think. That's the combat as it exists right now. Not too many people played the latest demo, so I'd like to ask here as well what you think of the combat mechanics now that I've laid them out, what other ideas would be interesting, what should be changed, etc. All of these mechanics are close to final, though I'm playing with the idea of a bleed mechanic still. That being said, everything here is only for the fencing style, and I actually have a couple other styles in consideration, including knife combat, kendo, and a specific type of non-human enemy. Anyway, thanks for watching, and please continue to support me as I truck this project along.